Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the show where we talk about finding strength when life falls apart. I'm your host, Melly, and around here, resilience isn't perfection. It's falling flat, getting back up, and maybe laughing about it later. From breakups to breakthroughs, we mix faith, neuroscience, and a little sass to help you rebuild a life that actually feels like yours. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. Today, I'm excited to introduce you all to a special guest. We have Mann Sanders with us, an associate minister at First Baptist Church of Glen Arden, where she serves as the director of the Sermon-Based Life Groups Ministry. Her passion is expository teaching and sharing the wonderful insights God has shown her in His Word. She's the author of the book When Your World Ends, and she has a passion for helping people rebuild after loss using the 7 steps from Genesis 1. Dawn, welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires.
Hi, Melly. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy and honored to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited to have a conversation with you today. Can you, to start us off, take us back to that moment in your life when life as you knew it kind of unraveled and share a bit of your story for those listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah. So I had what I term a series of unproductive relationships, the kind of relationships that don't bear fruit. In fact, I had a divorce and a broken engagement. But then God brought the love of my life into my life, and we got married. And then after we got married, in fact, my husband told me that we could have a year off from having children. He was a youth pastor and very much wanted to have children, and I did too. But I had several friends who had spent the first year of their marriage pregnant. They got pregnant really quickly, like within 3 or 4 months of getting married. And that changes how you relate to people. For a woman in particular, it changes how you respond and what's going on with you. And I just very much wanted to have a year, just him and I. And so he agreed that we could have a year where we weren't like not trying to have kids, but we weren't trying either. And so God blessed us to have that year, just the two of us, before we officially started trying to have kids. And this is kind of important because I'd had this series of unproductive relationships. My husband and I were meeting and got married relatively late in life. We met each other after we were 40 and started our courtship. And so I had actually given up the idea of having kids myself, Melly, from my own body because of my age. But we got married in time. We were still in our early 40s. I was about 42 years old when we got married and started trying to have kids. And then I had a series of miscarriages. I had at least 2 known miscarriages. I believe I had 3. And I say I believe I had 3 because there was one where I didn't get a positive test beforehand, but my body showed all the signs of my being pregnant. And so I got pregnant without a test, lost the child, got pregnant again about 4 months later, had a test, knew it was official, lost the child. 3 months later, got pregnant again, and then lost the child. 6 weeks after I lost that one, my husband dies of a massive coronary while out jogging.
Wow.
All of these events, as I'm sure you can imagine, were unexpected things. And so I had this series of unexpected losses that culminated in what I felt like was the death of my whole family. And with them, I lost my future too.
That is a lot of loss to go through in such a short amount of time. I remember when reading your book, you said you had this question to God that you posed, what now? After that night Reggie had died. How did that question sustain you through the days to come?
Wow. Well, God gave me an immediate answer. He told me that I honored my husband in life. And so for me to honor him in death. And that, Melly, was something I immediately said to myself, I know how to do that. You're right. I honored my husband in life. And so I know what to do. And I mention that because they don't teach you how to be a widow. They don't teach you how to grieve your husband. From the time we're born, we're taught things. We're taught how to walk, how to talk, how to feed ourselves. We're taught how to go to school. We're taught how to study. We're just taught lots of different things. Even in church, they teach you how to be a good parent. They even teach you how to be a wife and a husband, but they don't teach you how to be a widow or a widower, and they don't teach you how to grieve.
That's true. No, they really don't. That's something that in the worst possible moment is when someone actually learns how to do that, not before.
Yeah. And we learn by trial and error because we haven't been taught. And that's
Wow.
why, I asked what now because I did not know what to do. Not only did I not know how to be a widow, that word I write about in my book was foreign to me. Quite honestly, I didn't want to be her. I did not want to be Reggie's widow. So it wasn't even something I wanted to learn how to do at that
Yeah.
point. And so I was so thankful that God told me in very practical terms to honor him, which was something that I knew how to do as a wife. And I did not have to immediately take on that widow role.
Yeah, and I think that probably is universal for any circumstance that we go through where we're grieving or, trying to deal with some kind of big trauma. It's never something that we're like we want to go through. I know in my own life I went through a pretty traumatic divorce and I did not want to learn how to be a divorcee by any standard. And yet we're often called to these moments where we do go through these things and we do have to continue on and life does go on. What would you say in the middle of that kind of rebuilding phase that you were in? What did joy look like for you in that time?
For me, it looked like obedience. Because to be quite honest, the joy where like you feel good, I don't know when you're grieving that you have the I feel good moments, at least not long term. You might have a couple of moments where you have laughter, where memories come up that feel good. And if you think about joy in that way, about a happy moment, I didn't have happy moments. In fact, I wondered on a very deep level if I'd ever be happy again. But what I did have was the kind of joy where I knew that God was faithful. I knew from the loss of my dad that he would get me through this season and that I just needed to hang on through that season. And that's what I did because I even remember saying to God that I don't know what it's going to look like on the other side. I don't even know who I'm going to be on the other side because, like I said, I changed in that moment from Reggie's wife to his widow. And so I was a different person and I felt like a different person. And so the only joy that I felt in that time was me just, you know, hanging in there and going through the motions and I shouldn't say going through the motions, being obedient. Though there were times when I did feel like I was going through the motions to be quite honest. And what I want to say about that is I don't even feel like I was holding on to God in those moments. I feel like he was holding on to me.
In your book, you share about God's creative process in Genesis, which I really loved reading the beauty of the creation and how that relates to us and how that became your map for rebuilding your life. What would you say of the steps? And listeners, you have to get the book if you want to hear all of the steps. But what would you say is the one step that stuck out to you as the most important during this time?
Wow, that's a good question. I actually feel like there were two. The very first one, remain connected. Like I said, that I had to stay connected to God and I knew that. And as hard as it was during that time, and I say it was hard because these types of trauma really do test your faith. It tests what you know about God because the way it was for me, Melly, is the God I knew wouldn't have allowed me to have that level of pain. So I had to get to know God all over again. And that's actually brings me into step three and the emotions that I had around that and feeling as though the way I write about it and the way I talk about it to other people is that I had to reconcile the God I now knew with the God I used to know because they weren't the same person. Like I said, the God I knew before the tragedy would not have allowed the tragedy. And I had to learn to trust a God who would allow that level of pain, that would allow that level of tragedy. God is our protector, and that hasn't changed. He's still a protector, but God gets to pick and choose what he protects us from. And that's what the step 3 was coming to terms with the fact that God allowed that to happen in my life and learning to trust him.
Yeah, and that's so hard after you go through something like that to learn to trust God. Like you said, the God that you knew before, you didn't believe would have allowed something like that to happen. What advice do you have for the listener right now who is in the midst of that same kind of disconnect where they're like, I cannot believe that the God that I've followed would allow this tragedy to happen to me?
We as humans cannot fully understand God in his entirety. And so the first thing I would say to them is that it is possible for God to be a different person than the one we knew him to be.
Hmm.
And the second thing I would say is to allow him that freedom. We want to grow and change, and we want the freedom to grow and change, and ask the people in our lives to allow us that freedom, and to even recognize that people might misunderstand who we are in their humanity and their frailty. I also ask you to grant yourself the grace that you might have misunderstood who God is, and to allow your understanding of God to change and to grow, but also to recognize that God is God and he gets to decide who he is, not us. And not that, to put God in this box and demand that he be the God that we know him to be, to allow our theology, basically our understanding of who God is, to grow and change as we grow and change. And I want to be clear about that because God has not changed.
Right.
The Bible says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. The thing is that our understanding of him needs to grow and change.
If you could go back in time to the Dawn from that early loss, what would you tell her in those first days?
The first thing I think I'd tell her is you're stronger than you know you are. Even though, as I'm saying that, I remember in those early days, people telling me that the Lord doesn't give you more than you can bear. And I remember thinking, I wish I could not bear this. I wish I was not this strong. And people kept calling me strong. And I kept saying to myself, I am not as strong as you think I am. But I've come to understand that that this was something I could bear, even if it wasn't something I wanted to bear. And like I said, in that you're stronger than you understand yourself to be, and to once again to hang in there, because feelings are temporary and you will not always feel today the way you feel today.
Right. And that is so hard to, in the moment, realize that, we will feel differently and that we are probably stronger than we think in that moment. But at the same time, it's like, I love what you said because it's just so honest. Like you asked God, you wished you weren't that strong so you wouldn't have had to necessarily go through that. How is it that, like, what were the factors that helped you learn to rebuild trust in God, relationships with others during this time?
I think the biggest factor that helped me rebuild my trust was the feeling that I didn't have anywhere else to go. My walk with God was such that I knew he was my salvation. I knew him to be my salvation. And if I wanted to be saved, if I wanted to be healed, if I wanted to be delivered, as I felt teased by him, as much as I felt betrayed by him, I knew he was the only place for me to get the healing that I knew that I needed. And so, the book of Job talks about the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. And it also talks about how Job's wife said, curse the Lord, right, and die. And I was like, well, he's not letting me die. I write in the book about actually wanting the Lord to take me to. Now, don't get me wrong. I didn't do anything other than pray and ask God to take me. And I didn't do that because I knew life and death was in God's hands and that I could attempt to take my life. But God had already made the decision the day my husband died to take my husband and leave me. I could attempt to take my life, but once again, it was really up to God whether or not it ended. And so I didn't want to do anything to make my situation worse. I knew a lot of people who have tried to hurt themselves and wound up in worse situations than they were in the beginning. And so I didn't want that.
Right.
And so since I went to bed every night asking God to take me too, and every morning I was waking up, God was, and the fact that I was waking up, God was telling me to go on and live through what I considered the end of the world as I knew it, and hence the title, When Your World Ends.
Yeah.
And so because God was waking me up every morning, I was like, okay, God, you're the only one I know who can fix this. And even though you took away what you gave, I have nowhere else to turn. And so that, I think, was the biggest reason, the biggest thing was me going, okay, I have nowhere else. And so I have to somehow or another figure out how I'm going to do this thing because you keep waking me up every day.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because like you said, you knew that God was where you needed to turn for healing, and yet it felt God was the reason that this maybe happened, because God gives and God takes away. And that is a really hard concept, I think, for all of us to really understand. What do you say to the person who's grappling with that? Because I know sometimes people, they mean well, but they'll say something like, everything happens for a reason. Maybe God needed another angel. Or they'll just throw out these really they don't know what to say, because I think as much as we don't learn how to grieve, we also don't learn in the church how to help others through grieving as well as we could. Like, what do you say to the person who's just like, okay, this is God did this, and I'm just, they're angry perhaps at God, or angry at fellow members of the church who aren't saying helpful things, though they may be trying.
Okay, I'm going to deal with the unhelpful statements that people make because people do. They say, and it's not just during grief, it's like during any part of our lives, people say unhelpful things. What I can say there is the same thing Jesus said on the cross: forgive them, they know not what they do. And I say that because there went I. I'm not even going to say there, but for the grace of God, go I. There went I before it happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
I said the same unhelpful things that people said to me later because I didn't know how unhelpful they were.
Right.
And these are well-meaning people. They mean well. They want to help. They just don't know how. And so, like I said, forgive them because we know not what we do. As far as God and Him doing something that hurts, again, are we going to allow God to be God? Is He only God when He does what we want? Is He only God when He allows what feels good? Is He only God when we're in charge of what happens in our lives? If He's only God in those circumstances, then you've never allowed Him to really be God in your life. If He's going to be God, then just like parents make choices for their children that children don't like, God is going to make choices that we don't like. And I write about how He made some choices. These were choices. He chose to allow my children to die in the womb. He chose to allow my husband to have this heart attack. He chose for me to live on after those things. These are all choices that God made that I write about, that I have to live with. And I write about it in those terms, as you know, having read the book. And write, and I'm sharing this because I'm saying this to say, I don't sugarcoat it.
Right.
Right? Suffering is painful. But in the New Testament, it talks about, are we going to know Him in the fellowship of His resurrection? And we cannot know Him in the fellowship of His resurrection unless we, like Him, die. in some way, unless we experience death in our lives in some way and allow God to resurrect us and resurrect dreams. And so we cannot, like I just said, we cannot know that resurrection unless there is death. So again, in allowing that death, because we're never going to choose death for ourselves or anything else that we want in our lives. So are we going to allow God to decide what things are going to die and when, which quite honestly, we don't have the power over to begin with, or not?
And in that rebuilding, when eventually comes a new dream that God places in our heart, how do you recommend someone start to recognize that? Obviously, they have to go through the grieving process, and everybody's journey is different. But how do you recognize when God is doing a new thing?
You know, the word says, "Behold, I do a new thing." And behold is see, look. Basically, pay attention. When we're grieving, we're usually not paying attention. And what I mean by that is we're focused on the past. We're not focused on the present or the future. When God is doing a new thing, we have to be willing to focus on the now so that we can see it. Not only that, my mentor, Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith, in her latest book, Being Fully Known, talks about how we have to behold Him, not just our presence, but beholding Him. And how often do we talk about how we behold Him? That we focus on Him well enough to recognize Him. And I say that because how do we recognize a move of God? Well, we have to recognize Him and where He is in our lives today to recognize when He's moved from that. So, for someone who's grieving, which was part of your question, first off, I wouldn't necessarily tell them to stop focusing on the grief and on their past because grieving is part of the process. And many people try to rush through that part, they try to abbreviate that part. And it's part of the reason why we don't heal properly to begin with. And so, first off, I would tell them to grieve. We lost something of value, something that mattered to us, whether it was a person, a place, a thing, a dream, a career, a home. We lost things that mattered. And because they mattered, we, and I don't want to say owe it to ourselves because then that kind of gets into deserving, but that's a better word. We need to grieve them. We need to allow ourselves to feel not just the pain, but the love. I mean, grief is the expression of love when the object of our love and affection is no longer there. Whereas love is the expression when it is there. And so allow yourself the time, allow yourself whatever it is you need in order to grieve. But then once you're transitioning from grief to living again, and you'll start to feel a stirring, I believe. That's how it came for me and how lots of people I talk to recognize it, is they start to feel a stirring, a nudge, I believe, from the Lord to start moving forward. And so when you start feeling that nudge, I encourage people, in my book, I call it Seize the Moment at Step 2, because we can tend to want to linger in the land of the dead, in the past. We want to hold on to what it was that we had before, even though it's not there anymore. And here's the thing, God has already moved on.
Yeah.
Right? And so we're out of alignment with God when we try to hold on to what was. And so when you start feeling that nudge to move forward, when you start feeling life again, seize it. Because when God's ready for you to not live anymore, He's perfectly capable.
Right.
of reaching down and grabbing you like he did my husband and transitioning you.
Right.
Don't do it a moment too soon.
Yeah, and I love the way you word it in the book, seize the moment. And it really is. People ask, well, how do you know? And it's kind of like you just know, right? When you feel that
Hmm.
nudge from God, if you're not sure, you probably haven't felt it yet. And you just still need to spend the time in that grieving process, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I agree with you. It's like love. You just know.
Yeah, totally. Now, looking at the grieving process in a little bit more detail, how do you think what are some helpful things that folks who are working in ministry or maybe even just, attending church can understand about that if they themselves have not gone through it yet, as we all will go through grief at some point, but what are some ways that we can prepare ourselves to be helpful and to come alongside those who really do need that connection during that time?
Wow. I think it's okay to not know what to say. I think that many of us feel like we need to fill the silence, and there is a silence. I was recently watching the movie The Amateur. And in The Amateur, there is actually a character who is a widow, and she meets the main character who becomes a widower. And she shares with him this really powerful concept about how quiet it gets when someone you love dies. And it makes perfect sense because their voice, you're no longer hearing their voice, but not only their voice. She talks about how, the door opening and closing and just there are noises that people make in your life, and how when they leave, it gets so quiet. The challenge I think that we have is that God can also get quiet during those seasons. And we have a tendency to want to fill silence with noise.
Yes, that's true.
But I think that God wants to fill the silence, but not with noise. There's enough noise in this world. I actually think God wants to fill the silence with our voices once we become healed. That God is actually, during this season of grieving and healing us, preparing us for that new voice that we're going to have in the new season. Now, I know your question wasn't so much directed at us and preparing us, but I say that for the people who are coming alongside of us who desperately want to fill that silence. First off, you can't. I appreciate your heart for wanting to fill that silence, but you will never be my husband.
Right.
You'll never be the child someone lost. You'll never be the parent someone lost, the sibling, the fiance, the whoever. You will never be that person. And so you cannot fill that void. The only person who can fill that void is God. And so that's why I say, don't be afraid of the silence. The silence is God making room, in my opinion, for the next iteration of the griever's voice. Make
Yeah.
room for their voice the same way God is doing, and be okay just with the silence. And the second thing is presence fills voids in ways sound doesn't. And so just be present. Just show up and follow their lead. And
Yeah.
if they want to talk, let them talk. If they want to just sit, let them sit. If they want to go for a walk, go for a walk. If they want to watch a movie, watch a movie. You can also show up and clean. You can show up and cook. You can show up with meals already prepared. You can show up and take kids to do things. You can show up in lots of different ways that don't include trying to fill the silence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Especially, yeah, I think in our culture today, especially when we have a free moment, many of us, we'll put on, a YouTube or we'll listen to something on our phones. It's just constant noise, and silence in and of itself is a little bit foreign. I know even I was in a church class where we started and ended each of the classes with 3 minutes of silence. And it sounds like, oh, 3 minutes, that's not a long time. It felt like a lifetime to start and end the class with 3 minutes of silence, and yet, it is such an important spiritual discipline to be able to sit in that silence. And along with silence, I think comes the idea of rest, which is also something that we don't necessarily do well in today's culture. What do you say, like, what does rest look like for you now?
Wow. That is a good question. And I say that because my understanding of rest changed during this journey. So, you were asking me earlier about the 7 steps. My book is a deep dive into the creation story in Genesis 1. And when I first began studying Genesis 1, I thought it was just for me. And I got as far as the second verse when I realized it was a setup. And the second verse, for those who don't know off the top of their head, says, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." That description of the pre-creation earth, of without form or chaotic, void or empty or dark, confusing, described my life when I was grieving the death of and the loss of my family. But by the end of the chapter, and not just the chapter, by the end of the story, God had created the first 2 lives. He had blessed them to be fruitful and multiply and given them dominion over the earth. But they had also, and this is the part that people don't talk about as much, is they entered his rest. They talk about the fact that they were blessed to be fruitful and that they were given dominion. And then we kind of end because that's where the blessing in those verses end. But at the beginning of chapter 2, God talks about the Sabbath, and there's a blessing in the Sabbath. And the blessing in the Sabbath is not just that we can take a nap or that we can relax or that we can go on vacation. The blessing of the Sabbath is that we enter his rest. That 7th day is the first day in the creation story that has no end. All the other days conclude with, and the evening and the morning were the X day. That day, when we enter his rest, what it means is that God has now assumed control of his creation. Now, not that it was outside of his control before, but that he is now basically like the pilot in the airplane, the captain of the ship, where he is now making sure everything runs smoothly for the duration of the journey. Often we will hear throughout scripture where God gave Israel rest, which means peace, rather than war. There were times when Israel was at war, but now they had peace. And so for me now, rest is not just a nap or a vacation or an opportunity to veg out and watch some Netflix episodes or whatever. It is peace. And I'm always now, Melly, seeking his peace because that is when I am most at rest.
I love that. And how does somebody start to find that in their life if they are in chaos or not feeling, rest, feeling like they need to do the next thing, watch the next thing, say the next thing? How do they start to find that rest?
We are very much doers, and we live in a society, at least in America, where we're focused on doing and achieving and accomplishing. For me, rest is receiving. We're receiving not only his peace, but we're receiving renewed energy, renewal. We're receiving blessings. We're receiving even the breath, as we're breathing in and out. And people will say that when they talk about rest, they'll say, breathe deeply, right? Inhale and exhale. We're receiving. And it's about that. It's about receiving as opposed to me having to do something to feel like I'm productive. Rest is being productive. It is the most productive thing I can do.
I love that. It's a total change in perspective on it. Because a lot of times, yeah, like you said, we're in this culture of much, we're doers. So I will say, even I am totally guilty of, like, if I'm resting, I feel like I'm not doing enough. Like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this. But Oh, I love what you said. So for the person who's they're feeling that still like, okay, so I'm going to rest and they're, maybe putting a timer on like they did in my class, like we're going to have silence for 3 minutes and their mind starts to wander away from, focusing on God and resting in that. What do you say to that person who's like, I just can't rest. I am trying, but it's just my mind is full of just things.
What I say to them is that your mind can be busy and you be resting. If while your mind is busy, you're handing it to him, right? So something comes into your mind when you recognize, oh, I'm no longer quote unquote resting. Part of the process of resting, like I said, is receiving. And so we receive when we shift it to God. When we say, okay, God, this is on my mind, I'm giving it to you. Then when the next thing comes onto our mind, God, it's on my mind, I'm giving it to you. We also can be resting when we're busy working, because in that day, that seventh day that God rested, man was given work. The very first full day that man was a creation, God gave them work. He placed Adam in the garden and told him to tend and keep it. While he was tending and keeping it, he was in God's rest. Work can be peaceful if we're busy about our Father's business.
I love that.
If we're doing our assignment that God has called us to do, if we're fulfilling our purpose in life, which is the seventh step is play your role, which is fulfilling your purpose in the kingdom. You're still operating in his rest. And that's why I said it's a matter of him being in control. When we're following his lead, God is in control, and we're trusting him that we can accomplish what we're accomplishing. We trust him when we take a Sabbath break, but we also trust him when we go back to work.
Yeah, I love that. I haven't heard anybody put it that way before, and it just makes so much sense. Thank you. To the person who is in the midst of this rebuilding and grieving process right now, what is one either phrase or scripture that you would offer them to carry with them through this time in life?
The phrase would be that your ending just might be God's next beginning.
Love that.
I also will say that God's inviting you to join him in his next creation of you. Will you join him?
That's a powerful question. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Dawn, for sharing your vulnerability, your wisdom, your warmth with listeners. I know listeners are going to really get a lot out of this episode. And for those of you listening to this episode, I just want to let you know that we will have links to Dawn's resources in the show notes. So please be sure to check those out. And remember, if you are in a season of grief or transition, you're not alone. And I highly encourage you to check out the resources along your journey. So, Dawn, thank you so much for being here today. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
The pleasure has been mine, Melly. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If today reminded you that resilience is a practice, not a personality trait, you're in the right place. Keep showing up, keep rebuilding, and don't forget, even diamonds start as pressure and mess. For more faith-filled encouragement and real-life tools to help you heal and grow, check out the show notes for some free resources and ways to stay connected. See you next time.